Miriam Brown was humiliated and thrown out of a restaurant simply because she was black. But instead of accepting defeat, she bought that establishment and turned it into a haven for the marginalized. The events that followed would surprise even those who had seen many stories like hers. But let's start from the beginning. Miriam Brown, a 72-year-old black woman, was walking down a busy street in the city center. It was a hot day, and her feet were tired after a long day of shopping. She stopped in front of the window of a small restaurant, the same one she had always avoided. The place looked cozy. Inside, people sat at tables, soft jazz played, and the air conditioning promised a cool, comfortable environment. She had never entered this place because she had heard that it didn't always welcome everyone warmly. But this time, despite her inner doubts, she decided to step through the door. She wanted to rest and have a cup of coffee. As soon as she entered, the sound of the bell above the door caught the attention of a few patrons. For a moment, the conversations quieted, and Miriam felt their eyes on her. She was used to this feeling, the subtle tension in the air when someone stares but says nothing. However, she tried not to let it bother her. Slightly nervous, she walked up to the counter, intending to place her order. The restaurant manager, a white man in his 40s, stood behind the counter, staring at her. As Miriam approached, he leaned in, as if intending to say something important. His smile was anything but friendly. There was something cold and sarcastic in it. "Ma'am," he said, emphasizing each word with a special kind of disdain, "we don't serve those who, let's say, don't meet our standards. You'd be better off finding a place where your presence won't be such a dissonance." His words hit Miriam like a slap. Her heart raced. She froze for a moment, shocked by his audacity and blatant disrespect. It felt as though time had stopped. The restaurant fell into an awkward silence. The customers had clearly heard everything, but none of them intervened. Their eyes slid over her and then dropped back to their plates. In this silent room, no one cared about her humiliation. Miriam slowly lifted her eyes to the manager, who was already leaning back with a smug look on his face, clearly pleased with himself. She felt a lump of frustration rising in her throat, but knew she couldn't allow herself to cry. Too many times in her life had she encountered such treatment. Too often had her dignity been questioned. Without saying a word, Miriam turned and walked toward the exit. She held her back straight, trying not to show a trace of weakness, though inside she burned with humiliation. When the door closed behind her, a voice in her heart rang out, one she could no longer ignore. She was done with silence and compliance. That restaurant, that manager's look, it had become a symbol of what she could no longer tolerate. But at that moment, she had no idea that this humiliation would become more than just an episode in her life. It would mark the beginning of a transformation that would change everything. The next morning, Miriam Brown sat in her kitchen with a cup of hot tea. The sun gently lit the small room, contrasting sharply with her inner turmoil. The previous day, the events at the restaurant, the humiliation, it all replayed in her mind, refusing to let her rest. She was a woman who had seen a lot in her long life, and every time she faced injustice, she reminded herself that the world hadn't changed as much as she'd hoped. But this time, something within her had shifted. Miriam glanced at the photos on the shelf opposite her. They were pictures of her children and grandchildren, smiling at family gatherings. These images reminded her of what she had fought for her entire life, for their future, for their right to live without fear of prejudice. She had always thought that she had done enough, raised her children, supported them in tough times, helped her community. But after yesterday's humiliation, she realized that her fight was not yet over. She remembered her younger years when her parents had been part of the civil rights movement. Her father was an activist who marched for equality, and her mother supported the cause despite the dangers. They taught her that silence in the face of injustice was acceptance of it. "You must stand for the truth," her father would often say when she was a teenager. Those words echoed in her head like a thunderclap. Taking a deep breath, she rose from the table and walked toward the old wooden cabinet in the corner. She opened it and pulled out a small box where she kept her savings. Miriam was a practical person, and throughout her life, she had saved money for a rainy day. Those funds could have allowed her to live comfortably in retirement, but now she saw a different purpose for them. She knew that the restaurant that had thrown her out had been up for sale for some time. The owner had been looking for a buyer, and Miriam realized this was her chance. Rummaging through her papers, she found the contact information for her lawyer, who had helped her with financial matters in the past. Miriam didn't waste any time. She called him right away. "Good morning, Michael. It's Miriam Brown. I need your help," she said as soon as she heard his voice on the other end of the line. The lawyer, an old family friend, had been handling her affairs for many years. He was surprised by the call, as he knew Miriam to be a woman who never sought risky ventures. "Of course, Miriam. What's happened?" he replied calmly, expecting the usual questions about banking or property. "I want to buy a restaurant," she said without hesitation. Silence fell on the other end of the line. Michael was clearly trying to process what he had just heard. "Which restaurant? Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked, still slightly shocked by her determination. "The one I was thrown out of yesterday," Miriam said, and the firmness in her voice was unmistakable. She told him about what had happened, and the more she spoke, the stronger her resolve grew. This was not just about buying property. For her, it was an act of defiance, a chance to restore justice where it had been grossly violated. Miriam knew this wouldn't change the world overnight, but she was certain it was the first step towards something greater. Michael was silent on the other end, clearly processing what he had just heard. Then he replied, "I'll help you with this, Miriam. We'll get everything sorted quickly. Are you sure you're ready for this step?" "More than ready," she said firmly. When she hung up the phone, a faint smile appeared on her face. This was not just a decision. It was the moment when she took her destiny into her own hands. Miriam knew that this restaurant would become more than just a place for people to eat. She planned to turn it into a symbol of change, where no one would ever feel unwelcome again. A few days later, Miriam stood at the door of the same restaurant that had been the scene of her recent humiliation. But today, everything was different. She was dressed in her best outfit, an elegant blue dress that highlighted her status. Her stride was confident and her gaze firm. With her was her lawyer, Michael, who was handling the negotiations for the purchase. They entered the restaurant, and the same manager, who had thrown her out with disdain a few days before, noticed Miriam standing at the door. His eyes narrowed with displeasure, but he didn't approach immediately. Miriam walked up to the counter where he stood and called out to him. "I need to speak with the owner," she said in a calm but firm tone. The manager, initially surprised by her return, couldn't hide his irritation. He hadn't expected to see her again, and certainly not looking like this. But from her confident demeanor, he realized this was about more than just coffee. Silently, he turned and went to the back to fetch the owner. The few minutes of waiting felt long, but Miriam kept her composure, not letting the tension show. Soon, the restaurant owner, a heavy-set man with graying hair, emerged from the office. He approached her with the weary expression of a businessman accustomed to the daily grind. But as soon as he saw her accompanied by a lawyer, a flicker of concern crossed his eyes. "How can I help you?" he asked with feigned politeness, glancing between the lawyer and Miriam. "I've come to discuss buying your restaurant," Miriam said calmly, watching his reaction. Her words were so unexpected that the owner froze, not immediately understanding what was happening. "Excuse me, you want to buy my restaurant?" he asked, his voice filled with disbelief. Miriam nodded, and her lawyer, Michael, handed the owner documents confirming Miriam's intentions. The amount she offered was fair, allowing the owner to exit the business with a profit, but the expression on his face showed that he hadn't anticipated such a turn of events. He glanced at the manager, who stood nearby with a look of mild panic. It was clear neither of them had expected that the very woman they had treated so disrespectfully would return with an offer they could hardly refuse. "We're prepared to finalize the deal today," Michael said, handing the owner a pen to sign the papers. For a moment, the owner hesitated, wondering whether to accept the offer. But in the end, business is business. He looked at the numbers, and realizing the deal was a good one, sighed heavily and took the pen. "All right," he said at last, signing the documents with visible regret. "It's your restaurant now." As Miriam watched the papers transfer to her ownership, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. She hadn't just restored justice for herself. She had gained the opportunity to transform this place. After signing the documents, the owner quickly gathered his belongings and left without a word. The manager, who had witnessed the whole scene in shock, stood pale-faced, unsure of what to say. Miriam turned to him, meeting his gaze. "Your work here is finished," she said calmly. He froze for a moment, as if not believing what he'd heard, but seeing the resolve in her eyes, he understood this was not a request. Without a word, he removed his apron and quickly left the restaurant. Miriam was left standing alone in the restaurant, which was now hers. She slowly looked around the space, the tables where people had once sat, the counter where she had been humiliated. Now, this place belonged to her, and she knew there was still much work ahead, but she was ready for it. This was only the beginning of change. After the deal was finalized and the old staff had left, Miriam remained in the now empty restaurant, which was officially hers. The space felt new to her, even though just a few days ago it had been the site of her humiliation. Now, Miriam could start fresh and turn this place into something completely different. A place that served people and helped those in need. The first thing Miriam decided to do was make a few changes to the interior, so the restaurant would feel warmer and more welcoming. She reached out to local artists to help bring some color and life into the space. Instead of the restrained, almost cold design of the previous owners, Miriam aimed to create an atmosphere where everyone would feel comfortable, like they were at home. She added old family photographs to remind visitors of her roots and the importance of remembering one's history. But the most important change wasn't about the walls or furniture. Miriam decided that her restaurant should serve the community. She contacted several charitable organizations that supported the poor, homeless, and veterans. Her idea was simple. Every evening, the restaurant would open its doors to those who couldn't afford a hot meal. To do this, she recruited volunteers from local communities who enthusiastically responded to her offer. She also came up with a program to teach young people the art of cooking. Miriam reached out to several chefs and restaurant owners in the city to help her with this initiative. She offered to train young people from low-income families, giving them a chance not only to acquire a skill, but also to feel their own worth. Miriam knew that by giving these young people an opportunity, she was helping them avoid the same kind of injustice she had faced. When word of her initiative began to spread throughout the city, reactions were mixed. Many supported Miriam, seeing her efforts as important and necessary. Local residents who had long known her as a strong and kind woman were eager to help and support her new venture. People made donations. Some brought food, others contributed money. Many offered their help in running the restaurant. The place quickly became a symbol of unity and kindness. However, not everyone was pleased. Some of the restaurant's old clientele, used to its previous elite atmosphere, were outraged. They complained that the establishment was losing its prestige and that now it attracted people they didn't want to sit next to. These individuals stopped frequenting the restaurant, and Miriam knew she had lost a portion of her clientele. But that didn't bother her. She no longer wanted to see those who believed certain people didn't fit the standard. The first evening when the restaurant opened its doors to the homeless was a moment of truth. Miriam herself stood at the entrance, greeting people. She smiled at each person who walked in, offering them a hot meal and a place to rest from the hardships of life. Her heart rejoiced as she saw how grateful people were that someone cared about them. One of the guests, an elderly man, approached her at the end of the evening and with a trembling voice thanked her. "Thank you, ma'am. I thought places like this had disappeared." Miriam, touched by his words, replied with a smile, "We're here to stay and to help." The restaurant began to fill not just with the smells of food, but with an atmosphere of care and kindness. Soon, people all over the city were talking about it. People came to help, eat, or simply support her initiative. For Miriam, this restaurant became more than just a place where food was served. It became a symbol of how one can fight injustice through action, through caring, and through attention to those whom society often rejects. Miriam knew there was still much work to be done, but she felt she was on the right path. Her restaurant now belonged not just to her, but to everyone who needed support. Word of Miriam's unusual initiative spread quickly through the city. A few weeks after the launch of the restaurant's new format, local newspapers began writing about it. Journalists came to interview her, eager to learn more about the woman who had transformed an ordinary restaurant into a place that served meals not only for money, but also for those who couldn't afford it. The restaurant became a true symbol of change in the community, and many saw Miriam as an example of resilience and determination. One day, in the middle of the day, as Miriam was organizing the evening service, a young journalist from a local newspaper approached her. He was clearly impressed by her story and wanted to interview her. "Ms. Brown, tell me, what inspired you to make such a change?" he asked, as they sat at one of the tables in a quiet corner of the restaurant. Miriam looked at him with a smile, pausing for a moment as she thought about how best to express her thoughts. She knew that her story could inspire others, but she didn't want to be perceived as a hero. "It all started with humiliation," she began calmly. "A few weeks ago, I was thrown out of this restaurant simply because I didn't fit their standard, and I decided that I would never let that happen again. Not to me, and not to anyone else." The journalist listened intently to her every word, clearly realizing that he was speaking to someone who had not only changed her outlook on life, but also the entire concept of running a business. "And how do you deal with the fact that some people don't support your new approach? Surely many of the people who used to come here no longer want to visit the restaurant." Miriam nodded, agreeing with his words. "Yes, that's true. Some people feel the place has lost its prestige, but prestige doesn't matter to me. My establishment should be accessible to everyone, regardless of their status or means. Those who don't share these values don't have to come here. But for those who need food or support, our doors are always open." Her words were spoken with such conviction that the journalist was struck by her firmness and calmness. He continued asking questions about her vision, her plans for the future, and Miriam gladly shared how she planned to develop the restaurant, expand the assistance programs, and attract more volunteers. But not everyone viewed her success with admiration. As the restaurant's popularity grew, so did the number of critics. Some old clients, accustomed to the previous atmosphere of exclusivity, expressed their dissatisfaction. Critical comments began to appear on social media from those who felt the restaurant was losing its soul. Miriam knew there would always be people who resist change, but that didn't shake her resolve. One evening, as she was closing the restaurant after another meal service for the homeless, one of the women helping with the food distribution approached her. "Miriam, I've heard that some people in the city aren't happy with what you're doing. They're saying the restaurant is losing its prestige," the woman said, looking concerned. Miriam stopped, looked at her, and with a warm smile replied, "Let them talk. We're not losing prestige, we're gaining soul. If what we're doing can help even one person, then it's all worth it." But that wasn't the only challenge. Local authorities began to take an interest in what was happening at the restaurant. One city official, representing the interests of the wealthy residents, tried to arrange an inspection, hoping to find violations in her new concept. His main goal was to restrict or even shut down the restaurant if any non-compliance was found. Miriam understood this was an attempt to pressure her, but she wasn't backing down. She was prepared to fight for her right to run the restaurant the way she believed was right. When the inspectors came, they found no serious violations. The restaurant met all standards, and Miriam was able to continue her work. It was a small but important victory, one that strengthened her resolve and showed she was moving in the right direction. Despite the criticism and pressure, Miriam knew that her mission was important. The restaurant wasn't just serving food, it was offering hope. Every day, more and more people came to support her or become part of her initiative. The restaurant became a symbol of change, and despite the challenges, Miriam was confident that her venture was more than just a business. It was a real fight for justice and equality. Several months had passed since Miriam Brown had transformed the restaurant where she had once been humiliated into a center for aid and a symbol of equality. Her restaurant now operated not only as a place for paying customers, but also as a refuge for those in need. Every evening, the doors opened for the homeless, the poor, and veterans. The surrounding communities began to take more interest in and show respect for her work. However, success did not come easily. Despite the support from many townspeople, there were still those who continued to criticize her. Some local business people, seeing how much attention her restaurant was receiving, tried to find ways to undermine her reputation. There was even a rumor that they were planning to open a competing establishment to restore the old order. But Miriam wasn't afraid. She saw this as something larger, a struggle to change the way people thought. One evening, as the restaurant closed after another dinner service for the homeless, Miriam stood by the window, looking out at the dark streets of the city. Despite the pressure and challenges, she felt at peace. She knew she was doing something meaningful, and that gave her strength. At that moment, one of the volunteers, a young woman named Linda, who had once been in need of help herself, approached her. "Miriam," Linda began, her voice filled with slight nervousness. "I just want to say, thank you. If it weren't for you and this restaurant, I don't know where I'd be right now. You've changed not only my life, but the lives of so many other people." Miriam smiled and placed a hand on Linda's shoulder. "You are the very light that helps others. Never forget that," she replied. That moment became symbolic for Miriam. She realized that her efforts had borne fruit, not only in the material sense. Her restaurant had become a place where people could not only eat, but also find a new life. Every person who came through the doors became part of something bigger, a united community where everyone supported each other. Over time, her story began to attract attention, not only from local media, but also from larger publications. The restaurant became a symbol of the fight for justice and equality, which drew the attention of charitable organizations and activists. One day, Miriam was invited to speak at a conference dedicated to social justice issues. They asked her to share her story as an example of how even one place, one action, could change many lives. When she stood on stage before a large audience, her voice was steady and confident as always. She spoke about how she had faced injustice and decided not to give up, about how her restaurant had become a symbol of hope. Her words deeply moved the audience, and many approached her after the speech to thank her for the inspiration. But for Miriam, success and recognition weren't the most important things. Her greatest victory was that her restaurant had become a true home for those who had once been rejected. In the evenings, people continued to come, some just to talk, to find comfort or support. Every smile, every word of thanks was more valuable to her than any awards or recognition. One day, among the people who came for dinner, was the very manager who had once rudely thrown Miriam out of the restaurant. Now, jobless and with a visibly diminished sense of confidence, he sat quietly in a corner, clearly feeling uncomfortable. Miriam recognized him immediately. She could have approached him with a reproach or a reminder of his words, but she didn't. Instead, she walked up to his table herself, carrying a plate of hot food, and set it down in front of him. "Good evening," she said gently, smiling. "I hope you enjoy our food." The manager, not expecting such a gesture, looked up at her, filled with surprise and shame. He tried to say something, but no words came out. Miriam, understanding his confusion, didn't demand any apologies. Her gesture wasn't an act of revenge, but an expression of her true values. This moment became a symbol of her inner victory. Over time, the whole city realized that Miriam had created something much bigger than just a restaurant. It was a place where the boundaries between people blurred, where everyone could find support and care, regardless of their past. Miriam proved that even one action, one decision, could turn injustice into an opportunity for change.